It all began with the sky itself becoming angry at people and turning scarlet, clouds covering the horizon, and an eclipse splitting the sun into pieces. The hot sand melted under the flames of the heavens, the suffering faces of nature on the mountain peaks begged for mercy. The silence and howling wind were cut by the vile squeal of a hideous monster, streams of mucus flowing from its toothy mouth. A man running towards him with a heavy backpack on his back shouted back, waving a small but sharp dagger in his hands. The monster that attacked the man was an alien worm with a huge mouth and many legs. Its red pairs of eyes merged with the redness of the sky. The man, breathing heavily, leaned on both hands, tormenting the soft throat of the monster from the inside. After some time, the monster fell to the ground. The worm's mistake was that, obeying its instincts and desire to kill, it recklessly relied only on its own strength. The man, stained with someone else's mucus and blood, wiped it from his face with his sleeve, exhaling heavily. Having barely recovered from the shock and the realization that he had been able to kill the monster with his own hands, his thoughts were interrupted by a scream. The man was called unawakened. There was a worm lying at his feet, but when he raised his head, the stranger was stunned, because behind the team that had summoned him, monsters of unimaginably huge and furious size had gathered. A blond man in a red windbreaker shouted that the porter should work properly and collect the drops. A guy in a mask standing nearby shook his head. The man hadn't seen any corpses at all. He nervously grabbed the straps of his backpack with both hands and awkwardly shifted his weight on the spot, showering himself with apologies. The team cursed and moved on, commenting as a parting shot that the porters had become completely useless. The man froze, thoughts flowing through his head in a painful and hot molten stream. The world changed after the discovery of the Abyss, another dimension where monsters that existed only in fantasy actually lived. Moreover, after the discovery of the Abyss, extraordinary powers awakened in people, and with them, humanity began to destroy monsters and conquer the Abyss. Now, because of all this, people have come to be judged not by their personality or efforts, but by their rank of awakening. If you have a high rank, a good life is guaranteed. The man tore open the defeated monster's guts, pulling out a pink crystal from its body. He clutched it in his hand, never ceasing to think that he was only a porter, carrying the things of the awakened, since he himself had not managed to awaken at the age of 35. And until he awakens, he will not be able to live their life. Now all he could do was notify when the prey was collected. The porter turned around and his mouth dropped open in shock. The entire team of brilliant awakened ones had been killed. The boys were killed with obvious brutality, and a trickle of sweat ran down the man's face from the realization that he could be next. And so it happened. A thunderous, divine voice behind him announced that there was only one survivor left. The SSS rank monster, Asmodeus, whose horns seemed to support the very remains of the sun, looked at the insect man beneath his feet with narrowed red eyes. Frightened to the point of madness, the man, through a veil of horror and rage, performed the same maneuver as before with the worm. It was obvious that for the demon, the small human dagger was nothing more than a toy. So with a light movement of one of his hands, he cut off half of the guy's arm. The monster released the limb, its body made of human skulls, not even flinching. The porter fell to the ground screaming, clutching his elbow from which blood was oozing. The man struggled to his feet, swallowing angry tears. And at that moment, Asmodeus raised his hand again. From his long finger, a stream of either lightning or some otherworldly substance shot down, straight into the man's head. Blood began to flow from the point on the skin where the demonic weapon had pierced, and it ran down the porter's clothes. But he couldn't even move. Blood mixed with tears, his gaze stopped on the demon, and moments from the life of a real loser flashed through his head. His parents died in a car accident, he was bullied at school, and here he was ignored for the rest of his life because he was unawakened. In my fading consciousness, the thought still darted around like a bird in a cage, that I really didn't want to die as an ordinary porter, a loser, damn life. The man clenched his teeth with all his might. Blood continued to flow down his face, and the word awakening rang in his ears. In the darkness of space, the last drop of blood lit up with a bright light, sparkling like a precious stone. The space was illuminated by the brightness of multicolored flashes flickering in oblivion. All the conditions for awakening were satisfied. The landscape around the porter changed right before his eyes. Instead of a scorching desert, there was a planet. Instead of mountain peaks, there was a golden staircase and an unearthly deity hovering above it. The blood from his face disappeared, washed away. The man opened his mouth, looking at the majestic figure. Long white hair almost covered the face of the deity. The naked figure without signs of gender was as if carved from stone. The porter, in a momentary fit of confusion, eclipsed by horror, began to turn around. Has Asmodeus, this cruel demon who spits on human pain, really stopped? After all, a second ago the man was definitely not here. And now, like an observer, he looked at his own weakened body. The deity was already at the bottom of the stairs and was now softly laughing at the surprised man. The man fell to his knees, staring in amazement at the stately figure, asking who was in front of him. The gracefully sculpted lips stretched into a smile. The man did not need to worry about this because the deity, who was called the king, was supposed to grant the porter power. The poor man didn't understand anything. The words he was saying were all mixed up in his head. And most importantly, could this creature really have stopped Asmodeus? And although the porter did not utter a word, he realized with horror that he had heard an answer to his thoughts. The deity was asking him to trust him more. This someone sat on a throne that appeared out of nowhere, saying that he simply recognized the will of the man and his perseverance, and therefore chose him. But it would be better if the man thought about the impossibility of such a miracle. The porter saw a strange, huge palm reaching out to him, and in fear he asked again what the creature meant. The deity laughed again and asked to wait patiently for the moment when the chosen one would understand everything. The creature called upon a certain key, and suddenly, right above the two figures, a huge monster opened its mouth full of sharp teeth. The porter passed out, his mind drifting off somewhere far away, but not even a few seconds had passed before a bright light hit his closed eyes and strange childish voices began to sound in his head. The awakening was anything but gentle. The man was completely awake and confused at the same time when he was punched in the face. He opened his eyes sharply, and as soon as his head jerked from another blow, the offender asked if the victim had finally woken up. Almost falling, the stunned man saw Bei Hexa in front of him, who was laughing, saying that the opponent needed to be hit so that he would at least hear something. The porter named Taehyung, whose name was spat out contemptuously, didn't expect to see the bully from high school in front of him. Another blow sobered the man a little, who remembered himself while in the abyss. After all, he had been given power. Turning his head, Taehyung saw the system's inscriptions on the bloody canvas, his name, age, and rank. He had returned 16 years ago. A crazy thought flashed through my head, giving me strength and bringing a smile to my face. Unable to contain himself, Taehyung threw his head back and burst into laughter like a madman. Heksu abruptly let go of his classmate and took a few steps back along with his friends. They did not understand the reason for the guy's sudden madness. The red-haired bully got angry and was about to attack Taehyung, shouting insults in his face. But he was unable to achieve what he wanted, as someone else's fist landed in the hooligan's face. The blow was so strong that blood spurted from his broken lip. Heksu fell on his back, as if he had been thrown far back. His friends turned around in fear, not knowing whether to help the leader or deal with the offender. Beaten, but so happy, even though he looked crazy, Taehyung continued to smile. He was breathing heavily and didn't even notice how hot tears were running down his cheeks. Now the guy was also awakened. The sun illuminated several figures on the school roof. Heksu still hadn't risen since the attack. Taehyung silently watched the offenders. He sniffled and wiped away his tears with the back of his hand. Heksu's friends decided to use their abilities and summoned flames and thorny ice. They rushed at Taehyung, covering him with curses. The guy with the fire ability extended his hand, directing a fire blast at the offender of his leader, but it missed the target. But Taehyung took advantage of his classmate's hesitation and hit him with all his might from below on the chin. The second opponent didn't even have time to touch his victim before he flew back with a groan, having received a kick to the stomach. Throughout his unawakened life, Taehyung did everything he could. He trained without sparing any effort. I also studied all the available information about the abyss and its monsters, no matter how frightening it was. The man even collected all kinds of data on various skills including wrestling. And now, having received a second chance, he will never lose to some uneducated bullies. It was obvious that they didn't know the very basics. Their technique was so terrible, and Taehyung dealt with them just as skillfully. When the offenders were spread out on the ground, Taehyung flexed his fists, smiling and concluding that he would need to train again. Suddenly, he heard someone groaning behind him and slowly turned towards the familiar voice. Heksu woke up only now. He was rubbing his bruised face, cursing dirty at the awakened Taehyung. He instantly flared up with rage, promising to kill his opponent, and stone blocks began to grow right out of the guy's body. This was the stone skin ability, which strengthened the body with stone growths. Heksu swung to hit his opponent, but he managed to get into a lower position and successfully dodged it. Taehyung gritted his teeth and straightened up, but the other person's movements left pieces of stone in the air, painfully scratching his skin. He quickly got his bearings and raised his head in time, as the awakened one was already attacking from above. Hexu landed on the ground with incredible force, the floor beneath his feet crumbling, sending heavy piles of dust and rock into the air. The boy remained sitting, listening to the sounds, waiting for the dust to settle. In this dense funnel behind the awakened one, Taehyung appeared invisibly. He deceived the enemy, making him think that he was under attack. The newborn awakened bared his teeth and attacked Hexa, but he turned sharply, as if he already knew what would happen next. Taehyung let out a strangled cry as his fist suddenly began to bleed. As it turned out, Hex didn't let the skin get touched, but turned to the enemy with the part of his face where the sharpest edges were. And now he was grinning mockingly. Taehyung hissed, realizing that he had only hurt himself, and only managed to put his fists in front of himself before the next blow. The strong awakened one swung and threw the still weak Taehyung away from himself. He was thrown far back, landing on a hard wall, almost knocking him unconscious. Blood from his broken forehead was pouring into his eyes. Taehyung was lying in piles of rubble, all wounded and coughing violently. Hexu slowly approached him, laughing. He called the guy a bad actor, asking if he had finally come to his senses. A look of disgust appeared on the big guy's face. He called Taehyung a worthless, unawakened bastard. He grinned again, asking what he would do. Would he really try to run away again? Or maybe he will continue to try to gain powers, blindly relying on what he calls the skills of an awakened one. Taehyung remained silent. He knew that all awakened ones receive a skill and rank, starting from F rank, when the chosen one is not distinguished from an ordinary person. Ending at S rank, when one is worthy of being called a monster, the physical abilities and skills of awakened ones grow exponentially. Taehyung was unlucky. He received an F rank, the worst of all, and the skill Predator, which had not even been thoroughly studied until now. Just when Taehyung decided that he would never be able to handle Hexu, who had a C rank, something changed, and even the enemy's gaze became uncomprehending. The boy, who seemed already broken and defeated, suddenly came to life, blood-red energy flowing through his body, merging with the streams of blood. It was as if someone possessing incredible power had entered Taehyung and was now controlling this still weak body. The primordial voice reported that it did not feel like it had lost. The guy slowly rose to his feet, and around him a bloody flame literally blazed and danced in circles like a tornado. Hexu felt himself being blown off his feet by the emerging wind. He couldn't believe that the worthless Kim Taehyung had actually woken up. The former ordinary schoolboy tried to move his palm, fixing his gaze on it. He really felt how magic obediently flowed through his body. He didn't know what was happening, but it would all end if he killed the caster. At that moment, the enraged Hexu ran at the enemy with a roar, almost completely covered in stone from anger. Taehyung waited until the enemy ran up very close and put his hand in front of him. The awakened energy obeyed him with lightning speed and attacked. When Hexu, having brought almost all his strength into the blow, saw that the boy was controlling the flames with a wave of one hand, he froze. Taehyung himself seemed to be in a daze and acted on intuition. Biting his lower lip, he simply did what his newfound strength told him to do, relying completely on it. The funnel shifted to the middle, and then Hexu screamed in pain. All the stones gradually flew off him. At the same time, he lost his strength. Only small flashes could be seen in the air from afar if the students looked out the windows. But the next moment, the sky behind them turned red. Taehyung focused on his power, stretching out his hand. Explosions sounded around him and thick smoke was visible. Hex's face froze, his mouth dropped open as if in surprise and his eyes rolled back. Taehyung slowly lowered his hand, then looked down at his classmate's feet. The guy who just a minute ago was the strongest of the awakened now fell face down on the ground, raising heaps of dust. Taehyung screamed and came to his senses. His face was covered in sweat, and someone's voice in his head announced that the devouring was complete. Small stones began to appear on his hand, and as a result of absorbing the target, his rank changed to F. Moreover, the guy now had a new skill registered, Stone Skin. The pretty nurse in the school medical office turned in her chair toward the door and gasped. One shabby-looking boy was dragging along several classmates who looked no better. He greeted me hoarsely with a slightly trembling voice, and when he raised his head, blood was visible streaming from his broken forehead. After a second of silence, the nurse, having recovered from the shock, squealed questioningly. Taehyung immediately carried the children, including Bae Hexa, to the medical center after the fight. There, the nurse cured him with her healing skills using magical powers. I had to lie to her clumsily, telling her about the cause of the injury, a fall down the stairs, and thus managed to persuade the woman to continue without unnecessary questions. A little later, Taehyung left the school gates. He was completely healthy. He woke up and even got even with Hexu. But there remained a problem with the Predator, a new entity that appeared in the hero. Now his rank could change after the very first battle. It may be an F-rank skill, but it has the power of a C rank. Now Taehyung can even absorb other people's skills. The student walked thoughtfully up the stairs, not understanding why this mysterious king had given him such power and regressed him from an ordinary loser. Taehyung realized that he had only one thing left to do in this situation: find out more about the Predator. The guy approached a 2-story house with green gates and stopped, looking at the windows. He smiled dreamily and a little sadly, muttering out loud that he hadn't been home for a long time. After the death of his beloved parents, the boy remained to live with his uncle. Taehyung literally climbed into the apartment without asking. Knowing that his uncle would be late, he planned to look for information about such skills on his own. Strange sounds were heard behind one of the doors. The guy tiptoed over and carefully opened the door. A strange picture appeared before him. 3 strangers, 2 of whom were wearing masks, and a teenager on the floor collecting money. The boy suddenly raised his head and screamed. His freckled face turned red. He shouted the guest's name. He recognized Hwang Jae-yong, his younger relative, and asked in surprise why he wasn't at school. The boy's gaze fell on the box, under which were scattered bills and coins. He remembered that even before his own regression, this boy wanted to make friends with other bandits and took all the money from the house, getting into trouble. The strangers began to aggressively ask their victim who the stranger was that had come during the day. Taehyung realized that today was exactly what had happened. The bandit raised an eyebrow and shook his head mockingly, saying that now his interest was satisfied. He learned about Jaehyun's cousin. Taehyung watched everyone in the room carefully, trying to understand what was going on here. The gang leader, a tall, thin, blonde man, approached the guy, threatening to kill him, saying that they would just take what they needed and leave. He stood a head taller than Taehyung and casually patted him on the head, calling him an awakened elder. But instead of being scared, the bandit saw a grin on someone else's face and was stunned, his mouth slightly open in question when they told him they wanted to test something. While the stranger was thinking, Taehyung rose up on his toes and pushed him to the ground, pressing his hand to his left shoulder. He started coughing, fluttering around like a fish in water. He had not expected such an outburst from the boy at all. Jane was also stunned, frozen in place. The other 2 masked bandits perked up, ready to defend their leader. Taehyung, taking advantage of his opponent's hesitation, sat on top of him and reached for his head. He screamed in fear, trying to dodge, because he understood what would follow this movement. The hoarse screams gradually died down, and the bandit, not without reason, called the guy who attacked him a predator. A slightly crazy smile appeared on Taehyung's face, and a victorious sparkle played in his eyes. But suddenly the joy gave way to bewilderment. A voice in my head whispered that the predator function was unavailable. The heavily breathing opponent slowly opened his eyes and stared at Taehyung with his mouth slightly open. The same one was still hanging over him, with an open palm, and large drops of sweat were running down the schoolboy's face. Taehyung was so stunned by what was happening and the betrayal of the system that he didn't immediately notice the movement towards his head. The blonde felt completely in control of the situation, and with a lunge of his right hand, he hit Taehyung painfully on the head. He coughed hoarsely, finding himself lying on the hard floor a few seconds later. The blonde was already standing on his feet and felt much more confident, shouting curses at the schoolboy. One of his masked henchmen was awakened and directed the power of his chain abilities at the boy. The second one put his hand to his mouth and exhaled poisonous purple air. The leader, adjusting the bandage on his nose, grinned and sent poisonous vines of bleeding to his enemy. 3 awakened abilities attacked Taehyung at the same time. At first he cowered, but after a few seconds he no longer pretended to be weak, and the whole house shook. A thick column of purple smoke appeared in front of the dangerous trio and did not disperse. The blonde chuckled dismissively, muttering that the unawakened dared to pretend to be awakened and did not know his place at all. Suddenly, the system's voice was heard announcing that skill usage had been detected, and a silhouette appeared through the veil of smoke. The system confirmed the skills of chains, poison, and bleeding. Parts of the beast appeared before those present. Taehyung stood right in front of him and his defense. The resistance was obtained through mystical power. The guy grinned triumphantly, and stone armor suddenly grew on his arm. Suddenly, the power didn't work, and then neutralized the skills. The blonde froze in shock, feeling the air around him heat up. And the next moment something happened that he completely didn't expect. The weak and feeble Taehyung gained incredible strength and brought down an incredible blow on him, slamming him into the wall. The bandit, whose teeth had disappeared from his mouth as a result of the attack and whose face had turned into a bloody mess, looked at the enemy's glowing white eyes. The blonde was amazed at his strength because just a few minutes ago it had not been there at all. Taehyung stood by the window, the sunlight shining through the curtains and softly falling on his shoulders. He put his hands in his pockets, looking with a smile at the bandits sprawled on the floor. Now Taehyung learned two things. The status window is only visible to the awakened. It displays some information about the awakened. There was no shortage of mana, but the predator did not activate. Also, the passive effect of the predator is not indicated in the description. It neutralizes all negative effects. The guy thought gradually he would be able to confirm his assumptions. His thoughts were racing into the distance, but suddenly, Taehyung noticed how Jaeyoung threw himself at his feet, bowing to the very ground. The boy raised his head sharply and shouted in a respectful tone that, having just seen the incredible side of his elder, he, his cousin, repented of what he had done and asked for forgiveness. Taehyung raised an eyebrow as he listened to the boy profess his loyalty to him, swearing eternal allegiance. His relative had never shown such compliance before. But the problem wasn't even Jin. But what was about to happen? Clouds were gathering in the sky above the people and they didn't even notice it. The boy had even started barking like a dog, but suddenly he fell silent because Taehyung promised to forgive him. He folded his arms across his chest and lifted his chin, declaring that Jaeyeon would now come with him. Sometime later, several people appeared in front of a building, probably a factory. A sign stated that only authorized persons could enter the area. The trio were dressed in formal suits. The man in glasses looked up seriously, and the two girls behind him did not hide their astonished looks. And there was nothing to be surprised about. It seemed that things were going very badly because the gates had been breached. Unimaginably vile monsters were bursting out into the world from the burst sphere. The man noticed that 10 years had passed since the last disaster, when a gate suddenly appeared and the monsters began to crawl away. The long-haired girl quietly said that given the monsters and the inaction, there were only moments left before the disaster. Her colleagues shouted that the surrounding areas needed to be evacuated. The man sharply replied that there was no need because he had his barrier skill. The sphere's shell stretched like a ball. The man knew that the enemy's rank was only C. This means that the strongest monster that can come out from there is also a C rank. The sphere burst behind the man, but he told his stunned colleagues that even if an unexpected crisis occurred, everything would be fine. An incredibly vile monster, a head without a body with a protruding tongue, was knocked aside by a well-aimed kick from a man. He wasn't lying. He really could provide protection to the population with his power. The glasses flashed dangerously in the evening light, and in the madness that was unfolding, the fire bursting out of the sphere, as B-ranked, they would be able to hold back the breakthrough. Jane ran somewhere in the silence of the night. If there was someone to protect the city, everything should be fine. The boy shouted to Taehyung that he himself had told about the presence of management personnel at the site of the supposed disaster. He didn't deny his words because the original mana of these enemies was at the C-rank level, and the personnel who arrived there were B-rank, so C-rank monsters were no obstacle to them. Jaeyoung was even a little offended by his relative, since he had spoken about it himself earlier, but only if he was actually a C-rank enemy. Meanwhile, near the broken shell, the bodies of monsters lay piled up in a heap. The man in the suit had just finished dealing with another one. He was breathing heavily, coughing into his fist. It was strange that these low-ranking monsters were able to break through his B-rank barrier. The warrior turned around abruptly. He felt uneasy because the mana emanating from the sphere was of a rank higher than his. The girls stood closer to the gate. They called the leader because they noticed something. And indeed, something they had not seen before was clicking its huge teeth. A huge mouth soon burst open, and the roaring sound almost deafened the people present. No one expected to see such a huge troll with several pairs of glowing eyes and a muscular body. It was an A-rank ogre giant. He arrived with his minions, but even so, he surpassed all humans in strength. Large beads of sweat were running down the man's face as he looked in shock at the monster, whose rank was far from C. The fire that was slowly erupting from the gate turned into a massive explosion in a second, engulfing the entire area. Jaeyoung continued to run after Taehyung, admitting that he was right. But how could his relative know about the trouble since even the area hadn't been evacuated yet? Taehyung, in turn, knew that he had already been through this, but he spoke out loud about his intuition. He rolled his eyes and this angered the boy. Of course he didn't believe someone else's words. The relative continued to express his disbelief when suddenly, around the corner, both saw a terrifying picture. All sorts of monsters led by an ogre were running behind the crowd of people with a deafening roar. The fleeing human crowd literally drowned under the monster's feet, continuing to warn those who did not yet know what was happening. Pleas and cries for help were heard everywhere. Jane stopped abruptly and squealed like a girl, but the elder calmly reminded him what needed to be done. The boy, trembling with fear, turned to Taehyung, hysterically asking what he would do. Stone armor appeared on the boy's body under the dumbfounded gaze of the younger one. He was going to deal with this abomination and be there. A dark-haired man was looking out of the window at the city, talking to someone. Seeing that the situation was getting worse because the C-rank gate had been broken through by an A-rank force and it was impossible to send reinforcements, he turned around abruptly, his voice filled with despair, as he said that the only solution to the crisis now was an awakened A-rank. The man began shouting to his interlocutor that he was their only hope. The young man bit his lip, swallowing back tears. It was the awakened A-rank Blade of Madness and Hyunsu. He was both scared and sorry for the dead people, so he gathered all his will into a fist and swore that he would come to the rescue. The guy's peculiarity is the 8th grader syndrome. The small head, resembling a frog's on a tiny body, almost broke off from the impact. The tall green ogre threw back his head, spitting blood. Taehyung had accurately hit him in the chest. Another body flew into a pile of similarly slain A-rank monsters. The guy's hands were ablaze with the righteous fire of ability. Black threads were crawling like snakes across the space. Sometimes he didn't even have to do anything, just one movement of his hand, and the monster's limbs would fly off. A grin crossed his face. Could it be that the predator didn't work because he was 50% tired? Most skills use mana, but that doesn't mean you only need to worry about it. Because there is fatigue, it increases if you use skills or move. And the higher the fatigue, the more the power of skills decreases and the heavier the body becomes. Taehyung, fortunately, realized that he could absorb the bodies of monsters, thereby restoring mana without spending it. The system declared the target's life activity to be stopped, and the user restored his mana. But what was much better than this news was that the guy's rank had increased to D, and besides that, his skills had also improved. The more he uses Predator, the stronger he becomes. At this rate, he can become an S or even SS rank, or even the first SSS rank. When the monsters were dealt with, Taehyung shook himself off and decided to return to Jaehyung. But the hero couldn't leave so easily. As soon as he turned around, someone's huge body smashed through the wall of the building. A frail-looking guy, unfamiliar to him, swung his bright, glowing gold weapon at the dirty monster, threatening to avenge the souls of those killed. Kensu, shedding tears, shouted that, being a warrior of justice, he would bring the monster to justice. Taehyung, listening to this, only raised an eyebrow ironically. After all, other people's words sounded a little absurd. The monster, however, was not thrilled with the planned revenge, and roared with all his might, swinging at the little man. Hensu's eyes lit up with a bright light. He dodged and gripped the dagger tighter in his hands. Then everything that happened took a split second. The guy began to chop with his weapon everywhere he could reach. In the distance, a column of judgmental flame rose above the buildings. So hard did the awakened one try. Taehyung still stood motionless, watching the battle. He didn't know what to do. The guy admired the victory of the awakened one. It was probably he who possessed the A rank, the one who allowed the gate to be broken through in Taehyung's past life. Hyunsu's Blade of Madness. The rumors about it weren't lying. It really is incredibly powerful. The boy shook his finger and winked, rejoicing in his own victory because the stupid monster died from his sword of justice. Taehyung sighed because he remembered not only Hyunsu's desperate strength, but also his stupid nature, and yet it was strange why he was here. Before the protagonist's regression, Hensu was fighting an ogre in another part of the city, but now he stood and prayed for the well-being of the residents. Taehyung opened his mouth slightly, looking at the awakened man in the silence of the night. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he felt something was wrong with what was happening. The system announced the sensation of skill use, and a figure that had quietly appeared behind Hensu pierced his body with a dagger. He coughed up blood. His thin eyebrows drew together, and there was genuine resentment in his voice. A skinny, tall man with deathly pale skin and a bony face grinned, hissing that Hensu was caught. The city gradually lost its familiar outlines, but a false calm still reigned in people's homes. Jaeyeon leaned over the woman lying on the sofa, covered with a blanket. She seemed to be fast asleep. The guy frowned and wondered if everything was okay, then shuddered, because he had been predicted the death of many people. Taehyung looked seriously at his relative, and for some reason focused on the imminent death of the school nurse, Choi Nayeon. And the woman will die because she will help others instead of evacuating from the destroyed streets of the city. Since Jay can put people to sleep with his sleep skill, Taehyung ordered the stunned boy to do just that. The elder turned to leave and promised over his shoulder to deal with the rest. Now, Jae stood in their school nurse's apartment and wondered how Taehyung had found out about everything. Suddenly, an incredible guess struck his head, and the boy's gaze tensely stared at the wall. What he thought made sense, there was no other way to explain it. At that moment, the sleeping Nayeon frowned in her sleep. Jae vividly imagined the image in his mind, his elder, awakened with the skill of foresight. And although Taehyung would probably roll his eyes at this, the boy did not stop imagining him as a great magician. And now, the guy, with a slightly hysterical grin, understood that something was going wrong, looking at the wounded awakened one. On the huge corpse of the monster, the pierced blade of madness retreated from the strange man. He held his bloody chest and shouted to the stranger, asking who he was. The bald man laughed madly, muttering under his breath that the guy was alive even with his vital organs punctured, which was surprising. Ranks are completely different. Suddenly, his gaze glazed over and his eyes, like a lizard's, began to look in different directions. He howled that it would only be more fun. It was the B-rank villain Sandro with the stealth skill. Awakened people who commit crimes are called villains. Sandro is one of them, a murderous maniac who killed people for his own pleasure during the gate breakthrough. But here's the catch. Taehyung was sure that in his past life the villain and the awakened one had never met. He thought dejectedly that the future might have changed precisely because of his appearance. Hensu was mad with rage. Despite his wound, he continued to stand on his feet, cursing. The fiery blade appeared in his hands again, and the boy rushed at Sandro, threatening to punish him with his own hands. But suddenly, the warrior's hands stopped obeying him. He began to cough hoarsely, his eyes wide. The huge blade was pulled to the side, and even the villain froze in place, peering somewhere. Inexplicably, the giant's corpse beneath their feet came to life, the huge iron pendant on his neck stretching upward. The monster opened its eyes and growled, revealing rows of dagger-like teeth. The two opponents fell to the ground. While Hensu was beside himself with shock, Sandro was only pleased. He laughed and rejoiced at the incredible regeneration of the A-rank monster. Without letting go of the sword, the awakened one tried to take the right position for the attack. The villain landed on his feet, rising with difficulty. He decided to leave Hensu to the freak, the ogre. The man turned around to run away and gave a mad look with his red glowing eyes. He looked straight at Taehyung, the observer who found himself in the thick of things. Sandro stuck out his tongue and jumped up laughing and rushed towards the guy, intending to plunge a dagger into him because the more victims, the better. Taehyung didn't expect such an attack at all and froze in place, feverishly thinking about what to do. The villain looked terrifying, with a thin face covered in taut skin and glowing eyes, his weapon moving ever faster towards the awakened one's neck. But another second, and the steel hit the stone surface, which instantly appeared on Taehyung's neck. He chuckled, calling the villain an idiot. Straightening up and putting his hands in his pockets, the guy knocked the villain down with one movement of his leg, wounding him. He still managed to get his bearings, maintaining his balance. Laughing again, the man realized that in front of him was an awakened person. As he was about to attack, he froze because the stranger called out his name and rank. Taehyung walked towards the villain with long strides, asking if he was the psycho in front of him who loved to kill using his stealth skill. His palm was covered with stone armor, and a smile played on his lips. Taehyung was glad of such a meeting. Sandro was not going to give up and still struck the other man's hand with a knife. Of course, the stones reflected the blow. Cursing loudly, the villain advanced with enviable persistence, trying to find a vulnerable spot in the awakened one. Taehyung remained vigilant, covering himself with both hands that were covering the stones. Now the guy had only one weapon against the sharp blade, his own hands, endowed with power. A war dance began, where the partners desired only one thing, the death of their opponent. Finding time to rest, the fighters found themselves a few meters away from each other. Sandro admitted that the boy was quite skilled and confident. As it turned out, even the blades did not cause harm to the awakened one, despite the fact that the stone fragments flew in all directions. And while the huge revived ogre tried to defeat the Blade of Madness, the villain did not know how the awakened one understood who he was, but he thinks that he has a chance to survive. Taehyung didn't pay any attention to the fight nearby, as he was extremely focused on his own battle. The bald man's mouth stretched into a smile, and even the skin on his skull stretched, clearly showing the cross-shaped scar. Taehyung should have understood that the world doesn't follow plans. At that moment, the scoundrel simply disappeared. The guy realized that he had used the ability of stealth. Now it was worth being on guard, because now the enemy could appear out of nowhere. But this was also strange, because the villain knew that in any case, he would not be able to cause harm. Having said this out loud, Taehyung heard the insinuating whisper of his opponent behind him. He only laughed at such an assumption. The guy, confident in his untouchability, did not expect at all that the villain who appeared before him would be able to inflict a serious wound on his hand with the tip of a dagger. Taehyung looked in amazement at his stone hand, cut in half, so deep that the bleeding didn't even stop. The villain laughed as usual, asking the guy if he knew how many like him had already been killed. These fools who believed that their skills were invincible, Sandro circled around the enemy like the wind, inflicting more and more blows on him. As it turns out, once they realize their weakness, they immediately become lost and die from the desire to escape. So Taehyung also needs to understand something before he dies. Before pushing the guy with all his might with his body, the villain shouted that all skills have weaknesses. Taehyung was breathing heavily and hoarsely. Trying to get to his feet, blood was flowing from his mouth. To his regret, the guy was completely unaware of this disadvantage of stone skin. It does not block the blow completely. The unbearable shock breaks the stone, and the destroyed part is replaced by a stone with significantly reduced strength. Sandro knew about this from somewhere and was trying to achieve this effect from the very beginning. Taehyung smirked, but now he was absolutely sure that he could withstand a one-on-one fight against a B rank, because his physical abilities were much higher than the average D rank. The guy straightened up, and this confused his opponent, who began to examine his prey. He looked much more confident, and Sandro decided that the cornered boy had simply gone crazy. Taehyung asked with a smirk if the B-rank villain knew why the awakened one wanted to meet him so much. He only mocked his opponent, but he was no longer laughing when the beast appeared next to Taehyung. A huge shadow of someone else's hand covered the man, and he immediately noticed the ominous mana that he had been hiding for a long time. But the villain wasn't going to give up so easily. He laughed and called the guy an idiot. He immediately turned on invisibility and began circling around his enemy, believing that he would not be able to catch him. Taehyung's outstretched hand, which controlled the long, stretching lines, clenched. The villain himself said that all skills have weaknesses. This became clear to the guy when he absorbed ugly and strong monsters. Some of them kept escaping his sight, but eventually the predator caught up with them all. To put it simply, Sandro cannot be defeated. Even now, the man did not understand that his minutes were numbered and did not immediately notice the long tentacles around him. The moment Taehyung's eye lit up red, he said that the predator would catch its target no matter what. The blade fell from the enemy's weakened hands as he finally realized everything. The boy smiled as his palm closed, accompanied by a heart-rending cry of horror and pain. The city survived despite the fears of its inhabitants, and now a bright sun rose over the tall buildings. In the place where the battle took place at night, the unfortunate Hensu lay on the destroyed land. The guy wasn't sleeping or unconscious. He was muttering something under his breath, scratching the ground. He raised his bloody head with some difficulty, lamenting the villain who had ruined the entire plan, because even he, Hensu, could not defeat death. At this time, a huge shadow, still unnoticed by the hero, appeared in front of him. He hadn't felt so exhausted and tired in a long time, so he passed out as soon as an invincible ogre appeared on the horizon. The monster ran towards the man, intending to crush him with its fist. It roared deafeningly. The thing is, the ogre had trouble seeing small objects, and he hit the ground at random, making a huge crater in it. The ogre opened its mouth and growled, lowering itself to look at the man's body. But his roar was cut off, as what he saw made even such a monster surprised. The crater was empty. There was a cry from another human being who was cursing loudly. The monster turned around abruptly, and Taehyung materialized behind him, holding Hyunsu by the collar with one hand. He didn't even wake up, but when he woke up, he grinned, looking at the monster while the beast's tentacles enveloped them. There was a knock on the door of the Huang family, and the man and woman opened the door to the guest and cried out in shock. A slightly embarrassed Taehyung stood at the door, asking how his aunt and uncle were doing, and their son Jay looked happy and alive, excitedly greeting his parents. The elderly couple burst into tears at the same time, and the woman even covered her mouth with her hands to keep from sobbing out loud. As soon as they came to their senses, they began asking the boys what had happened, because they thought that they had died, and the house was in chaos. Jay kept trying to convince his parents that everything was fine and nothing had happened, citing Taehyung, but he only laughed it off. The news on the mobile phone screen calmed the population. The presenter spoke of a huge breakthrough in the gates after 10 years. According to government statements, the current threat of a gate breach has been completely eliminated. In anticipation of a further outbreak, the government ordered nearby schools to close for a week. Also, the survivors have begun to successfully recover, and the public can breathe a sigh of relief. Nayan still didn't understand how she ended up at home and told the police that she had miraculously fallen asleep and ended up back at her place. Hensu, in his hospital pajamas, fought off journalists, shouting at the top of his lungs to the residents that it wasn't he who defeated the giant ogre. The real hero was another man. But since the body of the giant ogre was not found, and the identity of the villain who attacked the people is not known for certain, people are concerned about the insufficient security measures. Listening to the latest news, Taehyung was pleased and soon turned it off. It was enough for him that there was not a word about him there. The guy was somewhere in the forest on the railroad late in the evening, a smile never leaving his lips. Now he had to move on to the next step. He was standing at a dark, long tunnel. The awakened one now had 3 skills, and getting stealth was especially fortunate, but at the current level it was too difficult to use all 3 skills at once. Using it foolishly will drain all your mana and also increase your fatigue level, which will end up pretty badly. And the best solution would be to purchase potions, elixirs created for various purposes, for example, to restore mana or fatigue. But they were expensive, so he needed to earn money, which is why Taehyung was here. He made his way through narrow corridors to hunt. He needed official permission. After all, even simply using skills without permission is considered illegal. There was only one thing left to do: clear out the unexplored dungeons. Now the guy came across a spider's lair. 3 huge female spiders with female bodies of rank B, seeing the man, were surprised by such an impudent act. One of them chuckled and suggested paralyzing Taehyung and building a feast. The guy shook his head. B rank isn't enough to change his rank. Do I really have to kill 100 of them? Hearing this, the spider sisters went berserk. They growled furiously, rushing towards the man who did not exactly understand the situation he found himself in. They puffed out their cheeks, preparing to release a web from the depths of their bodies at the awakened one. A huge ball of deadly web flew from 3 mouths at the boy. The sisters intended to eat him alive. They laughed, asking how the man felt now, whether he felt his body turning to stone. But their plans were not destined to come true. The predator helped Taehyung gain resistance. The trio gasped, stepping back as they saw the uninvited guest's grin, and he playfully announced that their skill would be useful to him. Women's screams were heard from the tunnel. They begged Taehyung to wait and spare them. Then the wind carried away the screams of pain and the sounds of spider flesh being torn apart. The system announced victory in the hunt and the registration of the new skill, paralysis. The gleaming windows of the skyscraper shone in the midday sun as the new South Korean Players Association took up residence. The main doors, in traditional Korean style, were guarded by 2 stern guards. In the office, a smiling girl with short hair was calmly drinking tea and talking with 2 men. One, he had noticeable gray hair and sat with his head resting on his clasped hands, looking around at his interlocutors. The second one was younger. Go Tae-wook, the deputy manager and human resources specialist of the new South Korean Players Association, swallowing nervously for some reason, with 2 of the association's best players next to him. Players were those awakened who were allowed to use their skills for various purposes. For example, training in the abyss, clearing dungeons. There are currently 5 centers for such players in South Korea. The largest Korean guilds, the 4 great guilds, the fighters, indivisible. Also masters, alchemists, magicians, wizards. These could control any element. Last but not least were the Nightwalkers informants. And the authorized agency managing the players, including the 4 great guilds, is the new South Korean Players Association. Now it's clear why Tae-wook, sitting in front of seemingly ordinary people, was so nervous. The girl was the leader of the Nightwalkers Guild and an S-rank player, UN. She winked, greeting the person across from her, whom she hadn't seen for a long time. Ji Jinwi, the chairman of the new South Korean Players Association and an S-rank player, looked at Een like a predator and thanked her for her visit despite his busy schedule. He immediately got down to business, asking if the girl had learned anything, and she immediately clarified whether they were talking about the Villains Guild. The Villain Guild that Sandro belonged to was a criminal organization founded by the most insane people, even among the villains. The members of this guild wear rings with 3 skulls. Aeon handed over a sheet of paper with the guild's latest movements listed on it, and there was also a list of the players the villains were targeting. The girl leaned back in her chair, twirling a strand of hair in her fingers. She was sure that Jinwi had not called her to personally hand over documents. He took the sheet of paper in his hands and burst out laughing, knowing that nothing could be hidden from the beauty. He paused for a moment and then said that he wanted to know Aen's opinion, which surprised his interlocutor. The man asked her seriously when she had taken the player test, and the girl replied with confusion that she had done it at the age of 19. when she had reached the qualifying age. Suddenly, En stopped short, looking at the strange expression on the chairman's face. Jinwee's lips stretched into a predatory grin. The warrior didn't believe that he would suggest what she was thinking about. And so it happened, the chairman asked if a high school student could fight a monster. At this time, Taehyung was sitting on a high mountain of spider remains and with a backpack full of crystals, calling the Alchemist Guild, one of the 4 great guilds. The guy held the phone in one hand, saying that he wanted to buy some potions, and with the other he clutched a huge and bright diamond. Finally, the 7-day school closure due to the gate breach is over. During these 7 days, Taehyung and Jae worked hard on their physical training, almost never letting go of the dumbbells. The elder also went on his own to clear the dungeon and fight monsters. After some time, he finally arrived at the headquarters of the Alchemist Guild to hear surprised exclamations at the number of magic stones. When Taehyung dumped his entire catch in front of the employees, they cried out in amazement, promising to take him to SVIP to make a deal with the alchemist. The guy needed to buy potions, get a mana stone, and increase his rank. But the most unpleasant thing he had to do was go to school. Taehyung sat alone at his desk, surrounded by the piercing glances of his classmates. They didn't dare come closer, talking among themselves. There were rumors that he single-handedly defeated Hex's henchmen. But no matter how hard he tried, the schoolboy still had big problems. Taehyung would have continued to ignore the whispers, but suddenly he heard steps in his direction. Only this made the schoolboy distract himself from contemplating the schoolyard through the window. At that moment, the desks and chairs standing in his path were overturned, and there was a loud crash. Several unfamiliar guys appeared in the office, and they didn't look too friendly. Someone sat down on the chair in front of Taehyung and threw their long legs and their changeable slippers right onto his desk. It was the awakened S-rank Lee Jung-jae himself, the one who was feared by the students who were discussing his classmate. It seemed like there was a flame burning behind this man. He was clearly dissatisfied with something. With his hands in his pockets, Jon J greeted someone he hadn't seen for a long time. The leader of the Daesun High School gang, a third-generation chaebol of the Daesun Company, a large corporation that sponsors Daesun High School. But what's most important for Taehyung is that this bastard bullied him repeatedly in his past life. He and his cowardly friends cornered a weaker and unawakened guy in the gateways to beat him up. Jon J always stood nearby, grinning mockingly, while his dirty work was done for him. He was also the main culprit who set Hexa on Taehyung just because the guy wasn't awakened. But now, looking at the stranger's feet in front of him, the guy didn't even raise an eyebrow, asking why on earth they were addressing him so freely. The beast inside the schoolboy awakened and he shouted for Jon J to get lost. One of the gang leader's henchmen immediately pointed his finger at the offender, calling him a bastard. But he immediately received a punch in the nose, which broke it until it bled, from his own leader. He stood up from his chair, kicking the small fry with his foot, reminding him that he should not be disturbed during the conversation. He returned to his conversation with Taehyung, who was still sitting in his place. A strange aura hung around Jon J when he spoke about Taehyung's encouragement after defeating Hexu. Suddenly, the chaebol stood up, his eyes blazing with a bright flame, towering over the schoolboy, warning that the enemy should not be teased by looking him in the face. Taehyung looked at the flames raging around Jon J's figure, amazed by the overwhelming magical power of the awakened S-class. Thin streaks of fire reached out to the guy. Their owner wanted to make the bastard learn respect and listen carefully when important things are said. But Taehyung already felt the predator in his hands. He was interested in the meeting of these two forces, but he was unable to verify what he wanted because a cold female voice, matching the appearance of its owner, asked Jon J to leave. The girl, without even turning around, deftly intercepted the hand of the chaebol's accomplice, which was about to dig into her shoulder, and it, accompanied by cries of pain, became covered in a crust of ice. Lim Ayong glanced around at those present, stopping at Taehyung, and she also advised him to finish. Seeing the unexpected guest, the guy's spirits perked up, and a smile appeared on his face even in such circumstances. This girl had many titles: school president, rich girl, Yu Ayan's half-sister, S-class awakened, model student, future SS rank player. Also the nobility of Oblige, the most promising in her circle. She has so many nicknames, and there will be even more names. But now this schoolgirl intended to stop the upcoming fight between the boys. She walked right up to the impudent chaebol Jon J and looked him in the eyes without fear, even though she was shorter than him. He laughed, saying that there was a misunderstanding, because now one can just observe an ordinary conversation between friends. The girl didn't react to this lie in any way. She only mockingly asked if friends really get punched in the face. The guy smiled differently. His eyes lit up with a warning red. He asked not to cross the line. Ayan looked calmly and confidently, her blue eyes fixed on the face opposite her. She promised to help him leave if Jia didn't do it himself, so let him drop everything and go away. Taehyung looked at the two flaring waves of elements and mana hovering around the guy with his mouth slightly open. If they continued, they would destroy half the class. Jon J fell silent, holding his head high and looking at the girl from under his lowered eyelashes. Ayeon fearlessly met the murderous gaze without even blinking. She also remained silent. A few seconds passed and Jon J was the first to retreat. He turned towards the door, waving his finger, saying that he was not going to waste his energy on a fight. But one could not expect submission from such a man. He shouted that such words were expected from him. Then he turned around abruptly, intending to throw a stream of deadly fire from his magic at the girl. The intercom beeped. On the second note, Ayeon also froze. She was also ready to accept the attack, freezing the sphere. Taehyung, who still hadn't gotten up from his chair, stared intently at the speaker on the classroom wall from which the melody was heard. After a few short bars, a melodic female voice announced a minute of attention. The broadcast department spoke. The Players Association will hold a special lecture in the main hall. All students must immediately gather in the main hall. The voice kept repeating that it was important, and it was about the Players Association. Hearing this, Jon J lowered his hand with the sphere and repeated with his lips what he had said earlier. The guy's face showed uncertainty for just a moment, but he was able to quickly hide it. He looked at Ayeon, who was gesturing for him to come over to fight. The chaebol raised an eyebrow and smirked, hissing that the announcement had come at the right time. This time he actually turned around to leave, calling his henchmen after him. The guy added that the rest were very lucky. Ayeon seemed not to even hear these words as she froze strangely in a warlike pose. There was a knock. She turned to Taehyung to check his condition. The warrior had barely asked not to thank her when she discovered that the guy had disappeared from his place. He was already at the door, asking Ayeon over his shoulder why she froze, whether she hadn't heard the announcement about the gathering in the main hall. Without waiting for an answer, he shrugged his shoulders and said that he would go first. When the door slammed behind the guy, Ayeon's mouth opened in shock. No one had ever treated her like that before. After some time, all the school children actually gathered in the main hall. Everyone was wondering what the special lecture organized by the Players Association would be about. Was it really organized because of the gate breach? The students were greeted by the Deputy Director of Human Resources of the Hero Association, Go Tae-wook. The man at the lectern explained the reasons for the meeting. One was the lack of response to the gate breach, an apology, and safety training from the Players Association. Just as Tae-wook was about to tell about the second reason, the mana around his figure noticeably changed. The seething purple energy echoed its master, who, with a predatory look, informed about changes to the player exam for those students responsible for the future of New Korea. Jon J, hearing this, cursed quietly, calling Taehyung a real bastard. Ayeon, who was standing nearby, was biting her fingertips. She was also thinking about Taehyung, thinking that she would need to find out about him later. The subject of other people's thoughts was sitting in the hall and openly yawning from boredom. The other students looked at each other, not understanding what this had to do with them, since this exam was for 19-year-olds, and they wouldn't be able to participate this year. Tae-wook heard the youth's voices and said that the information was related to the students, which is why he came here to give recommendations. Recently, an unexpected event occurred. The gates were broken through, and now the number of monsters and dungeons has increased dramatically. The man leaned both hands on the podium and announced that the Players Association acknowledged the shortage of personnel, and, therefore, starting this year, there are plans to start receiving recommendations even from high school students. The students almost jumped out of their seats when they realized what they had heard, and the hall buzzed like a beehive. Tae-wook talked about each school's guidelines, which included testing abilities, grades, and behavior, and knew they were being blatantly lied to, especially about selecting people based on complete numerical data. And although the deputy manager said that only high school students could take the exam, the selection was already underway, right now. After all, Tae-wook had an interesting skill hidden in his aiming gaze. He was able to identify the strongest with the eye of an observer, a kind of camera, the ability to quantify the total number of abilities of the person you're looking at, and even see the player's status window information when concentrating. Tae-wook smiled at the corners of his lips as he wanted to clarify something for the children. He thought that the numbers here were definitely better than elsewhere. These school children would become great players. And most importantly, the man had been eyeing the two most amazing students at this school for a long time. Fire mana and flame magic raged under Jon J's undisguised evil gaze. Ice Princess A Young also showed good promise. In some ways, she even surpassed the chaebol. Tuuk received a list of recommended targets from the Nightwalkers, but those are large numbers for an unprepared awoken. The man thought that he would have to write a letter of recommendation upon returning to the association, and he turned to the students with a grin. But he was not allowed to finish. To everyone's delight, Jon J raised his hand, asking for the attention of the gentleman player. He did not expect at all that anyone would dare to interrupt him, and silently stared at the student whom he had noticed earlier. The guy paid attention to the deputy chairman's words. He said he would provide recommendations for replacing a player. So, are there any who are completely unsuitable for the position? After all, the player exam is a test to determine whether any of the awakened have the right to become a player. He glanced slyly at Tae-hyung, who was standing nearby, picking him out from the crowd with just one glance, and said loudly that the unawakened did not need to hear this. You might think that a player's main advantage is his strength, but the point was completely different. Of course, the rank of an awakened being, the ability to deal with various situations, and extensive knowledge of the abyss, all these complex abilities must be tested to become eligible to become a player. Jon J continued, saying that the first difficulty is awakening. He looked at Tae-hyung again, mockingly suggesting that the unawakened might be hurt by hearing this, and laughter was heard after such words. The guy didn't want to give in to provocations, but immediately assumed that by saying such a thing, the chaebol clearly wanted to check whether his classmate was awakened. He looked at Tae-hyung with disdain. Indeed, if he was awakened, he should quickly prove it. At that moment, Ayeon couldn't stand it. Turning around, she angrily called out Jon J's name. Tae-hyung rolled his eyes and looked at the girl unkindly, because he didn't need unsolicited help. Ayeon blushed slightly under their gaze, but shaking her head, she decided that she didn't care anymore. Let them sort it out themselves. Tae-wook, after thinking for a moment, replied that he understood what the student was talking about, but that attendance at this lecture was entirely up to the students. Jon J wasn't going to remain silent. He turned everyone's attention back to Tae-hyung, loudly asking if he could unawakened get a recommendation. Or maybe the guy wants to say that he doesn't care at all about things like testing players. If Tae-hyung can't clearly prove that he is awakened, then there will be no chance of passing the exam. The guy smiled because he knew that he didn't have to prove himself in person to get a recommendation. He knew about the deputy chairman's skill, and he actually saw two with abilities among the dark figures, and a little later a third, Tae-hyung himself. However, his expectations regarding Jon J were not met. Although the guy had an S rank, he was a simple hooligan and did not fit in. But Tae-hyung, in the opinion of the students, was unawakened, with an unknown potential level. Just as the man wanted to touch the boy with invisible threads of ability, the system suddenly announced that it was impossible to confirm the information. The deputy chairman stepped back in shock. This had never happened before, and at that moment, Tae-hyung's voice was heard, addressing the chaebol, saying that he was right in his judgment. What is the use of listening to such information for the unawakened? It will only hurt Jon J's pride in vain. Tae-hyung took a deep breath and turned to his puzzled classmate. To everyone's surprise, he showed him the middle finger, firmly saying that he was leaving the lecture. Well, let the chaebol stay and listen to the end after such an act. Jon J grimaced, calling the guy a bastard. But Tae-wook seemed oblivious to the quarrel, still preoccupied with his own failure. What caused the most misunderstanding was that he had used his abilities on different people before. Even with the association president and the guild leader N, there were never any problems. The students parted and Tae-hyung silently walked through the living corridor. He no longer paid attention to the looks, not even feeling the harshest of them, Jon J's look, on himself. Tae-wook still couldn't come to his senses. It was as if he had been doused with ice water and made to doubt his own strength. Tae-hyung continued walking towards the door in complete silence, without even turning around. But the man tested his ability on him in vain. The system did not give any other answers. Again and again, impossible. But now Tae-hyung suddenly turned around sharply, staring at Tae-wook, as if he knew everything about him. And only at that moment did the man see the light, realizing that the boy had simply allowed himself to be seen. There was something incredibly, deafeningly powerful in front of him. And the guy himself possessed remarkable strength. He was clearly more gifted than Ayeon. The next day, when he arrived at school, Tae-hyung went straight to the library. He had been studying various literature for a long time and was quite tired when he noticed shadows approaching him. Tae-hyung had been thinking about using his free time to search for clues about the king, but it seemed he wouldn't be able to do that. Jon J's henchman blocked his path but did not touch him, apparently having received orders from the boss. One of the guys, the one his boss had hit, arrogantly and with a hint of fear demanded that he follow them because Jon J was looking for the guy. Tae-hyung decided to tease the rascals, and although he could no longer concentrate on reading, He lazily turned the page, stating that he didn't really want to go. But the guys weren't so simple. One with a broken nose grinned and asked if Taehyung ran his aunt's restaurant. These words made the guy suddenly lose interest in the book, and he couldn't hide his surprise. He raised his head and almost dropped the textbook on the floor, to which he was told that this was what Jon J had asked him to give. The accomplice smirked, finding Taehyung's weak spots, saying that he doesn't have parents, that his aunt has a hard time, and does her nephew really want to make her life even more difficult? When the bastard laughed, closing his eyes and saying that he would make Taehyung go anyway, he didn't have time to notice something flying into his face. The door to the library was blown to pieces by the explosion. Even the wall was damaged. Many shelves were found lying on the ground, the books were charred, and the bloody accomplice was suffocating. Taehyung had long since stood up and was now holding the bastard by the neck with one hand, lifting him into the air. The rest lay unconscious on the floor, their eyes rolled back. Now madness was splashing in Taehyung's eyes. He demanded not to be forced to repeat it twice, and to finally answer where Jon J was now. Having knocked the answer out of the half-dead student, Taehyung went to the school gym, where they were already waiting for him. Next to the self-confident Jon J stood a tall man in a suit, the guy's bodyguard. He used the skill on Taehyung, but reported that something amazing had happened. Sol Hundo, an A-rank hunter, had already used a status-reducing skill several times since the person he needed arrived. The man cried out that he couldn't do anything, and if Taehyung had such a level of resistance, then he was probably an A-rank awakened being. Jon J chuckled when he heard this news and immediately suggested that they talk as friends. Taehyung only gritted his teeth and said nothing, amazed at the insolence of his opponent. He said that he was harsh, but in fact he did not intend to harm Taehyung. He wanted to find out about him as soon as possible. The boy smiled and said that after finishing his studies he would create a guild that would become the successor to Taesun. But even a genius like him couldn't do everything alone. Taehyung only gritted his teeth and said nothing, amazed at his opponent's impudence. Jon J gave a thumbs up, saying that he needed people who weren't losers like Heksu, but truly talented ones. And his choice fell on Taehyung. It was he who now acted as such a person. Like a movie hero, the rich man spread his arms and laughed, urging his classmate to forget old grievances and join him. The flame of madness burned in his eyes. Jon J promised wealth and glory, and even the guy's family would be able to escape from poverty. The flow of unnecessary words was interrupted by Taehyung. He said that it sounded like complete nonsense. The hypocrite's fiery speech truly angered the awakened one, so much so that stone plates began to appear on his face. Then his entire torso and arms were covered in hard rock. Taehyung exclaimed that the impudent fellow had crossed the line. No one had ever refused or interrupted Jon J, so the guy fell silent, stunned. After a few seconds of silence, he chuckled and lowered his head, agreeing with his interlocutor. But the next moment, the flames of his ability's fire scorched the room, and the guy announced that he would now explain in detail what he meant. Hundo immediately dropped to one knee and placed his palms on the floor, activating his ability. He used a special magic, hiding space. The entire room was covered with an invisible grid. Space, a barrier skill that surrounds the space with a shield. The man shook his palms, as now the magical forces inside the shield could not be sensed from the outside, and the entire school would not know about the fight. As soon as he asked where to start the check, his master already rushed towards Taehyung. The same one jumped almost to the ceiling and, with his jaw clenched in anger, directed a stone fist at the enemy. The same one, smiling madly, rushed towards him in a similar manner, clutching a fiery sphere in his fist. As the boys got closer to each other, the small stream of flame transformed into something much larger, separating the students. The stone and the flame collided with each other in a powerful two-fist strike. The flames burned Taehyung's skin fiercely, and he clenched his teeth to curse. The guy managed to jump back from the new attack, but still, Jon J received less damage. The rich student's next attack almost proved fatal for Taehyung. The fiery explosion in the middle of the room was incredibly powerful. Burned Taehyung alive, he coughed up blood, greedily gulping air. Diverting fire slightly towards Jon J laughed, asking if Taehyung now understood everything. Hundo stood silently, his hands in his pockets, enjoying the sight of 1,000 fiery flashes. The flames didn't touch him. The man pursed his lips, thinking that he felt sorry for Taehyung in his own way. Probably an awakened A rank with high body strengthening skills, with such a level of combat sense and willpower, it's hard to believe that he's still a high school student. He probably usually can't even find an opponent, but today's battle exceeded the expectations of everyone present. Jon J, an incredible S-rank awakened being, nearly destroyed the enemy. Hundo shook his head, mentally advising Taehyung to learn his lesson and give up. But suddenly the man froze, and not a single thought came into his head from what he saw. Jon J continued to force Taehyung into the corner with a barrage of blows, and so far he had succeeded. But somehow the guy suddenly regained his spirit, as if he had received nourishment from outside. Now he had taken the lead in this battle, and with animal strength he attacked Jon J. The stone fist crashed tirelessly into the enemy's face, and one of the last blows sent him flying to the side. Hundo didn't expect at all that some brat would throw out his master. The guy lay on the broken wooden floor, breathing heavily from the strain. Purple lightning bolts of rage began to fly around Yoongjai's head. He screamed that Taehyung had no right to touch him, and now he couldn't even move after the attack. The schoolboy's security guard froze in shock, mouthing that his master couldn't get up. Isn't Taehyung's skill limited by armor? What kind of person is he? And although blood was streaming down the guy's face and he himself was wounded, he stood firmly on the floor, clenching his stone fist, and exclaimed that he had finally succeeded. There are 3 skills in total that Taehyung acquired thanks to the Predator: Stone Skin, Invisibility. And then, having cleared the tunnel, he took the spider paralysis from the sisters. However, the awakened one did not use all of his skills from the start. C-rank paralysis cannot easily overcome S-rank resistance. Invisibility is quickly broken by a wide range of fire attacks. But a Predator is a last resort and should not be resorted to haphazardly. Therefore, Taehyung's goal was to accumulate paralysis in the enemy in close combat. The status reduction skill has a greater effect if it is boosted by a direct hit rather than applied from a distance. If paralysis is inflicted repeatedly with continuous strikes, even with an S-rank enemy resistance, he will not be able to withstand it. The smoke from the recent fire gradually cleared, and Taehyung resolutely headed towards the prone enemy. The master's guard also seemed to be under the spell of the awakened one and was paralyzed. The man thought that what had happened was incredible, because the schoolboy had defeated the gentleman in a direct confrontation, which exceeded all expectations. Taehyung himself stood silently, bending over the defeated enemy, looking at him attentively. He was conscious and began to whisper something with dry lips, saying that he knew something. In response to the surprised look, the guy replied with a smile that he had underestimated Taehyung. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been beaten by such trash. Jon J held a small crystal in his hands and kept saying that now he could do the same. The next moment he squeezed the stone hard, and it crumbled into many pieces in his palm. Taehyung gasped, leaning back, something terrible unfolding before his eyes. It was as if some force had lifted Jon J into the air, and a fiery skeleton as tall as the ceiling grew above the guy. The guy laughed, covering his face with his disfigured palm, and said that now he too would be a worthy opponent. Taehyung immediately turned to run, and this entire fiery mass rushed after him. The skeleton, controlled by Jon J, obeyed its master without question and quickly reached for its victim. Taehyung managed to jump back when a huge fire sphere fell at his feet. His fist also grew in size, hanging over the skeleton in its awakening. Focusing on the upcoming blow, Taehyung directed his stone hand forward. The skeleton's mouth opened and a stream of fire poured into the air from its dark interior. Despite this, Taehyung still fearlessly approached the monster. The stone fist heated up as it made its way through the streams of bright flame. The temperature was so high that the stone could not withstand it and cracked, revealing human skin. Another explosion seemed to split the room into several parts. Taehyung fell down from a height. He fell to the floor, then leaned on his elbows. Jon J and the skeleton leaned over the guy. Hundo knew that this was the master's skill, the true form of Blazing Heart. In his normal form, it would be difficult to reveal the true power of the S-class. But before that, the gentleman used one thing: a magic enhancement stone. The magic stone is the heart of a monster, as it was also called, a product obtained through processing. It temporarily enhances magical power, giving the wearer the ability to emerge victorious from the game. If Hundo was right, then his master was now capable of unleashing his S-rank power to its full potential. Still, the man knew that there were problems with this too, and he rushed towards the guy. The guard knew about the gentleman's temperament and shouted at him to stop, as he could even kill Taehyung. Moreover, the magical power is too strong for the guy. He won't be able to cope. His blood vessels will burst due to the leakage of magical energy. A fiery arrow instantly flew at the place where the man stood. Launched by the irritated words of the guard Jon J, he jumped to the side, letting out a muffled cry, avoiding being torn to pieces by the explosion. The guy, meanwhile, had almost lost his face. He was gradually turning into a fiery chimera. Seeing how Taehyung understood Yoongjai, he ordered him to shut up. It was impossible to stop. The battered but still alive awakened man raised his head sharply. The huge one flew off and shouted in the voice of a classmate that he couldn't be given orders, throwing fire spheres. Even the owner himself no longer understood where he was or what was happening, having completely dissolved in the sea of fire. Jon J's face was already crumbling from the high temperatures. He was screaming furiously, wishing Taehyung death. Hundo was sure that the master had gone crazy and was wondering how to stop him. He ran to the hole in the floor where the sphere had hit and called out to Taehyung, urging him to stop fighting and run. The man crawled to the edge and extended his hand to help the boy out, saying that he would somehow stop the gentleman. But instead of gratitude, he received a solid punch to the jaw. This attack literally knocked the strong guard off his feet. He flew back several meters, coughing up blood. An angry Taehyung was heading towards him from the smokescreen, and he had no intention of running away. Of course, he recognized the S rank, but he himself was prepared for battle. He took a lot of recovery potion with him. The boy restored his mana and magic, preparing to become himself again. Now the predator has awakened. In the office of the new South Korean Players Association, Chairman Jinwee sat at the head of the table listening to Taewook's report. Hearing the level of power of the awakened beings revealed, the man couldn't help but scream. The speaker nodded, having seen it with his own eyes. Jon J has 1,900, Aeon has 2,300. Both are confirmed S-rank awakened. The assistants looked through the documents and were amazed at the wealthy student's strength, comparable to that of an A-rank hunter and the Japanese saint. Jinwee laughed joyfully. Could it be that now even in New Korea there was a saint-level hunter? Saint. As one of the hunters representing Japan, the girl was 19 when she first tested her level and turned out to be a monster whose total points exceeded 2,500. And even the monster's number was only. That's not enough. Taewook couldn't get Taehyung's numbers out of his head. There were more than 5,000 of them. With a serious face, he walked towards the exit of the office, wondering whether it was a mistake or an illusion. He knew for sure that he had to find out for himself. Hundo looked ahead and trembled all over, not believing in the reality of what was happening. He sank to his knees, muttering that it was impossible for a human. This time, Taehyung's avatar, a huge bloody knight, appeared as tall as the fiery skeleton. He was completely submissive to the schoolboy, who, as it turned out, had no intention of giving up. Turning around its axis, the monster opened its huge mouth, releasing the tentacles of the predator. In response to this, Jon J became incredibly angry, directing more and more streams of fire. Even his clothes were scorched. All because a bastard like Taehyung rejected him, the heir of the Daesung group, an S-rank player. He wanted to say something else but began to choke, greedily gasping for air. Then, gathering the remnants of his mind, he loudly shouted his name, but at that moment he was already under attack from Taehyung. He shrugged his shoulders. The guy didn't care about the opponent's rank and his regalia. Taehyung smirked, red flashing in the pupils of his eyes. Struck by the refusal and hurt in his heart, Jon J cried out desperately. He suddenly saw not Taehyung but a real deity who controlled the elements. The guy stepped back in horror, instantly falling silent. Taehyung told him that he possessed the power of a king. Jon J couldn't run away. He couldn't hide. The predator's tentacles were immediately directed at him from all sides. The gentleman's eyes widened in silent shock. He no longer had the strength to scream. The part of the building where the two strong players were fighting was engulfed in flames, which started after a deafening explosion. Jon J lay on the ground, finally defeated and trampled in this battle. Hundo, rejected but loyal, slowly approached him on stiff legs. But Taehyung was very surprised when the man passed his master and walked towards him, falling to his knees. The guard bowed his head, admitting that he was incredibly surprised. A rank player Hundo didn't expect to pull out Jon J under such conditions using Predator. It didn't matter. Since Taehyung had already taken the skill, the man asked what he was thinking about. After all, his master is the heir of Taesun. How is the student going to deal with the consequences? Taehyung chuckled. He wasn't the one who started the fight, and anyway, did he really look like someone who would be scared by all this? But the guard shouldn't worry, because the young master won't be killed. In return, the awakened one wanted to receive payment for Ji's life. Hearing that Mr. Heir of Taesun, Hundo turned cold, realizing what his interlocutor was leading to. Taehyung stretched his lips into a smile, deliberately slowly scratching his chin. His eyebrows shot up. The guy suggested that he could get 1 billion for Jon J.